Oh, so as I was saying, it's Christmas Eve. Tomorrow morning will be Christmas morning. We'll get to open presents and have fun with our families. But every year we get to have our story time together, and I didn't want COVID to take that away. So tonight we're reading two stories. We're reading Song of the Stars, and then the next book that we'll read is our favorite Christmas book at my house, and it's called The Crippled Lamb by Max Lucado. So let's go ahead and tuck in. The world was about to change forever, and it almost went by unnoticed. But the leaves that night rustled with a rumor. News rang out across the open fields. A song drifted over the hills. The wind whispered it softly in the sycamore trees that waved their moonlit branches to the sky. A barn owl took flight. Woodland creatures stirred. It's time, it's time. In the pine woods, 2 deer raised their heads. A big brown bear sniffed the air. A red fox darted. The faces of little flowers lifted to the skies. It's time, it's time. The skies shouted to the seas, that thundered it to the waves, that roared it to the great white whales, that sang it to the starfish in the deep. And tiny sandpipers danced it on shining sands. It's time, it's time. The running rivers bounded over boulders, and the otters clapped and played and sang to the ducklings that splashed, and quacked to the salmon that leapt and leapt. And tiny field mice and insects and little creeping things and sparrows and robins and every single blade of grass squeaked and hummed and chirped and sang, it's time, it's time. Wild stallions drummed it into the ground. Get ready, be glad, be glad. On a lonely peak, a lion raised his strong head and roared it out to the empty wilderness. The mighty king, the Prince of Peace. All the stars joined together in a chorus that rang out through the heavens, the bright and morning star. And on a hillside overlooking a little town, sheep muzzled their new lambs, the Good Shepherd. Suddenly, angels lit up the whole sky, and a great choir sang it out loud. It's time, he's come. At last, he's here. And in the little town, in a little shed, in a little window, a candle flickered in the dark. And a tiny cry rang out in the cold night air. And high above, a single star set in the highest heavens shone out brighter than all the others and poured down silver onto that little shed. A light to light the whole world. The animals stood around his bed, and the whole earth and all the stars and sky held its breath. The one who made us has come to live with us. And a young mother with no place to rest, nowhere to stay, kept it as a song inside her heart. Our Redeemer. And they gazed in wonder at God's great gift, lying in a bed of straw, wrapped in rags, a tiny little baby. Heaven's Son, sleeping under the stars that he made. Isn't that a great poem book? That's one of my favorite Christmas books. I love reading that every year. But this is the book that always makes me cry. I love this story. Max Lucado wrote it a long time ago, and we read it every single Christmas. I've been reading this book to my kids since they were little, and I just found out from my oldest son that I'm pretty soon going to have some grandkids that I can read it to. So I'm excited. I get to keep reading this book for a long time to come. This is called The Crippled Lamb, and it's about a tiny little lamb named Joshua. Once upon a time in a sunny valley, there lived a little lamb named Joshua. He was white with black spots, black feet, and sad eyes. Joshua felt sad when he saw the other lambs with snow-white wool and no spots. He felt sad when he saw the other sheep with their moms and dads because he didn't have a mom or dad. But he felt saddest when he saw the other lambs running and jumping because he couldn't. Joshua had been born with one leg that didn't work right. He was crippled. He always limped when he walked. That's why he always watched while the other lambs ran and played. Joshua felt sad and alone, except when Abigail was around. Abigail was Josh's best friend. She didn't look like a friend for a lamb. She was an old cow. She was brown with white blotches that looked like rain puddles on a path. Her belly was as round as a barrel, and her voice was always kind and friendly. Some of Josh's favorite hours were spent with Abigail. They loved to pretend that they were on adventures in distant lands. Josh liked to listen to Abigail tell stories about the stars. They would spend hours on the hill looking into the valley. They were good friends. But even with a friend like Abigail, Josh still got sad. It made him sad to be the only lamb who could not run and jump and play in the grass. And that's when Abigail would turn to him and say, "Don't be sad, little Joshua. God has a special place for those who feel left out." Josh wanted to believe her, but it was hard. Some days he just felt alone. He really felt alone the day the shepherds decided to take the lambs to the next valley where there was more grass. The sheep had been in this valley so long that the ground was nearly bare. All the sheep were excited when the shepherd told them that they were going to a new meadow. As they prepared to leave, Josh hobbled over and took his place on the edge of the group. But the others started laughing at him. "You're too slow to go all the way to the next valley. Go back, slowpoke. We'll never get there if we have to wait for you. Go back, Joshua." That's when Joshua looked up and saw the shepherd standing in front of him. "They're right, my little Joshua. You better go back. This trip is too long for you. Go and spend the night in the stable." Josh looked at the man for a long time. Then he turned slowly and began limping away. When Josh got to the top of the hill, he looked down and saw all the other sheep headed toward the green grass. Never before had he felt so left out. A big tear slipped out of his eyes, rolled down his nose, and fell on a rock. Just then he heard Abigail behind him, and Abigail said what she always said when Josh felt sad. "Don't feel sad, little Joshua. God has a special place prepared for those who feel left out." Slowly, the two friends turned and walked to the stable together. By the time they got to the little barn, the sun was setting like a big orange ball. Josh and Abigail went inside and sat and began to eat some of the hay out of the feed box. They were very hungry, and the hay tasted good. For a little while, Joshua forgot that he had been left behind. "Go to sleep, little friend," Abigail said after they had finished eating. "You've had a hard day." Josh was tired, so he lay down in the corner on some straw and closed his eyes. He felt Abigail lay down beside him, and he was glad to have Abigail as his friend. Soon Josh was asleep. At first he slept soundly, curled up against Abigail's back. In his sleep he dreamed. He dreamed of running and jumping just like the other sheep. He dreamed of long walks with Abigail through the valley. He dreamed of being in a place where he never felt left out. Suddenly, strange noises woke him up. "Abigail," he whispered, "I'm scared. Wake up." Abigail lifted her big head and looked around. The stable was dark except for a small lamp hanging on the wall. "Somebody's in here," Josh whispered. They looked across the dimly lighted stable. There, lying on some fresh hay in the feed box, was a baby. A young woman was resting on a big pile of hay beside the feed box. Joshua looked at Abigail, thinking his friend could tell him what was going on. But Abigail was just as surprised as Josh. Josh looked again at the woman and the child, then limped across the stable. He stopped next to the mother and looked into the baby's face. The baby was crying. He was cold. The woman picked up the baby and put him on the hay next to her. Joshua looked around the stable for something to keep the baby warm. Usually there were blankets, but not tonight. The shepherds had taken them on the trip across the valley. Then Josh remembered his own soft, warm wool. Timidly, he walked over and curled up close to the baby. "Thank you, little lamb," the baby's mother said softly. Soon the little child stopped crying and went back to sleep. About that time, a man entered the stable carrying some rags. "I'm sorry, Mary," he exclaimed. "This is all the cover I could find." "It's okay," she said. "This little lamb has kept the new king warm." A king? Josh looked at the baby and wondered who he might be. "His name is Jesus," Mary spoke, as if she knew Josh's question. "God's son. He came from heaven to teach us about God." Just then there was another noise at the door. It was the shepherds, the ones who had left Josh behind. Their eyes were big and they were excited. "We saw a bright light and heard the angels," they began. And then they saw Joshua next to the baby. "Joshua, do you know who that baby is?" He does now. It was the young mother who was speaking. She looked at Joshua and smiled. "God has heard your prayers, little lamb. This little baby is the answer." Joshua looked down at the baby. Somehow he knew this was a special child, and this was his special moment. He also understood why he had been born with a crippled leg. Had he been like the other sheep, he would have been in the valley. But since he was different, he was in the stable, among the first to welcome Jesus into the world. He turned and walked back to Abigail and took his place beside his friend. "You were right," he told her. "God does have a special place for me." Isn't that a sweet story? I'm glad that we got this few 15 minutes together, and I hope that you go right to sleep and you fall asleep and you don't cause your mom and dad any trouble, and have a Merry Christmas tomorrow morning. Bye now.